All right, well, it's 6 o'clock, so I should welcome everybody, and especially welcome you, Paddy. And thanks everyone for being here with us. My name is Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation, and I'm your host for this event. Before we begin, please be aware that this event is being recorded, so we can post it later to the Search Foundation YouTube channel, and I'll post a link to that in the chat section. Indeed, I'll post links to lots of things in the chat section, so don't worry if you miss a reference while I'm speaking, such as where you can buy body count. I'll post a link to that shortly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we're meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners, and First Nations all across the continent. In the Blue Mountains here, I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land, where we say Warami Gamarada. Welcome, comrades. We're very lucky to have Paddy Manning with us tonight, but before we get into that, first I'll tell everyone about the event and then give a 30-second intro to Search and then a 1-minute intro to Paddy Manning and his book. Paddy will then speak for about 25 minutes, and after that we'll have questions, which I invite you to submit in writing in the chat section to me directly. With about 10 minutes to go, we're going to hear from Sophie, an organiser from the School Strike for Climate in Melbourne, for 5 or so minutes before we wrap up and finish with a song. During the song, you can hang up or you can stay on the line for a few minutes and can post messages to everyone, including Paddy, in the chat section. To enable us to run this efficiently, all participants will be muted unless called upon to ask a question. After you've asked your question, please mute yourself again. When you submit your question, please let me know if you are happy to ask the question yourself or if you'd like me to ask it on your behalf, which I'm very happy to do. As I said, the chat section is limited to messages to me as the host for most of the meeting. Otherwise, I won't be able to collate the questions coming through. As mentioned, at the end of the meeting, you will be able to message everyone, including Paddy, and post any links or points you would like to make there. So a quick intro to Search. Search is a membership-based democratic socialist organisation that links and enables socialist activists across political parties, generations and movements all around Australia. We have members from diverse backgrounds and interests, but we have common aims and values, summarised in our goal of democratic ecological socialism. We run socialist education programs, publish news and views on Facebook and at search.org.au, and we put on events like this one. I encourage you to like the Search Facebook page to keep up with our events, and go to search.org.au if you're interested in applying for membership, or simply get in touch with me to talk about what Search does. Our contact details are on the website and our Facebook page. Now to introduce Paddy Manning and his new book, Body Count: How Climate Change is Killing Us. Paddy is contributing editor politics for the monthly magazine and author of 4 books, including Inside the Greens, Born to Rule, the Unauthorised Biography of Malcolm Turnbull. Over a 20-year career in journalism, he has worked for the ABC, Crikey, the SMH and The Age, AFR, The Australian, and was founding editor and publisher of Ethical Investor magazine. In his latest book, Body Count: How Climate Change is Killing Us, his latest book is, in the words of Bob Brown, a climate emergency tour de force. In the book, Paddy paints us the big picture. He revisits some headline events which might have faded in our memory: the Brisbane Floods of 2011, Melbourne's thunderstorm asthma fatalities of 2016, and brings to our attention less well-publicised killers: the soil-borne diseases that amplify after a flood, the fact that heat itself has killed more people than all other catastrophes put together. In each case, he has interviewed scientists to explore the link to climate change and ask how, indeed whether, we can better prepare ourselves in the future. Most importantly, Paddy has spoken to survivors and families of victims, creating a monument to those we have already lost. Donna Rice and her 13-year-old son Jordan, Alison Tenner, the Buchanan family. These are stories of humans at their most vulnerable and also often at their best. In extremis, people often act to save their loved ones above themselves. As Body Count shows, we are now all in extremis, and it is time to act. In this Zoom forum, Paddy will talk about the book for 25 minutes or so, after which we will have questions for around 30 minutes, and as I said, we'll hear at the end from a school climate striker from Melbourne, Sophie. So Paddy, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you everyone for zooming in. And yeah, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, although I'm coming to you from a boat, so up near Pittwater, and Yeah, pay my respects also to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty never ceded. Uh, I just want to talk to you about how and why I started, on this book, and why I came up with the idea, and then what I found, and then some of the lessons that I kind of took from the book, including, a few things that surprised me. So, please, through Luke, if you, I'll obviously happy to take questions at the end, but yeah, if there's at any point, you want to stop me or something, I don't know, please message Luke and I can answer any questions along the way. But I'll just, I've done a fair few interviews and stuff around it now, this book, and so I've kind of got a bit of a spiel, and I might just launch into it. I came up with the idea for body count in a few years ago. I've written about climate change on and off for, quite a few years, going back to my days launching Ethical Investor in, 2000. But also before that, I worked as an environment policy analyst at the New South Wales Environment Protection Authority, and I was sort of attuned. It seemed to me that over the years, what happens when we have natural disasters that are linked to, it seemed obvious to me that were linked to climate change. Nevertheless, what happens is in the middle of a tragedy where there's loss of life, there's a reluctance to raise the topic of climate change. It's somehow seen as politicizing or opportunistic to start talking about global warming. And that was certainly the case with Black Saturday. That was certainly the case with the Queensland floods, and I think it was the case right up until the most recent bushfire season, in Eastern Australia, the Black Summer, where I think you saw a determination from the ground up, at the community level, that people would start talking about climate change. But when I embarked on this book, it was because I thought that what happens is, I learned this as I went through the research process for the book, that what happens is that you have a natural disaster, there's loss of life, there's a tragedy, there's a reluctance to talk about climate change, and then the actual hard science that will connect that event with global warming might take years to come in. And so, to detect a climate fingerprint and, attribute any given extreme weather event to global warming, to determine the degree to which it was made more likely or made more severe, well, that actually is hard. That's painstaking research. And it doesn't happen for every extreme weather event. It only happens for the most significant ones, and it takes ages. And then there'll be an article in a scientific journal that's peer reviewed, and then there may or may not be coverage in the back pages of a newspaper. But there generally won't be a major debate about it. And the people that were impacted by that natural disaster, certainly nobody goes back and has a conversation with them to say, oh, did you realise that that event which took your family, took your loved ones, that was caused by global warming. So I wanted to join the dots and have and kind of show how all of these things were connected: the increasing severity of bushfires, the increasing intensity of extreme rainfall events and flash flooding, the rising heat waves, which is in fact the biggest killer of all, and a whole bunch of other things that I've kind of learned along the way, like the rising incidence of certain diseases, which at the simplest level, as the tropics expand with warming, we are becoming more susceptible to tropical diseases, and then there are also the mental health impacts of drought. And so it seemed to me that this was an important way to cut through you know, we've had more than a decade of climate policy debate in Australia, climate wars, and I think the public has tuned out to a great degree, certainly up until the last bushfire season, and then now we've had the pandemic, and the policy debate about climate change is conducted in terms of a couple of degrees warming, or in terms of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, or percentage emissions reductions by a certain year, or, you know, the impact on electricity bills. And these are all kind of you know, facts and figures that get lost, I think, and get easily confused in the public mind. And it's a distraction to the real impact that climate change is having already on us, on our health and the health of our loved ones. And so climate change is not a problem for future generations, and it's not a problem for the natural environment and the, you know, animals that depend on, you know, the environment and a safe climate. It's a problem for us now. And so I kind of decided that it would be a good way to cut through all of that policy debate to really talk to those group of Australians who have already suffered the most from climate change. So those Australians who have lost immediate family to warming. And so that was the project that I embarked on. And I had the idea in 2017, but I was writing a history of the Greens, and I ran way over time and did way too much research on that, and didn't get a chance to start this book, Body Count, until, and by the way, the title was always in my head, was Body Count. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and I didn't start until early 19. And a key moment came when I went to a Stop Adani rally out at Parramatta, and a doctor from Western Sydney, Kim Lu, she's a Vietnamese background, and she is a member of Doctors for the Environment Australia, and she was talking at the Stop Adani rally at Parramatta, and she got up and she talked about how, you know, global warming has a disproportionate impact on the western suburbs because it's hotter, and there's ground level ozone, there's worse, the air quality is worse. You've got the inversion layer, and it's a bowl, and there's a lot of geographic features that make Western Sydney, you know, make it more I suppose hazardous, and as the planet warms. And she ran through those facts and figures in this speech. You know, this is after Bob Brown and, you know, other people had spoken. And then she talked about the story of one of her patients of 14 years, a guy who she didn't name, but she told the crowd at the rally that she had written heat on the death certificate for the first time she'd ever done that. She'd never written heat down on a death certificate. So she told the story of how this patient, later worked out his name was Chuck McLeod. He was 82, and it was a heat wave. It was a few days after Christmas. He had a lot of comorbidities. He was diabetic. He had had a heart attack in the past and had had a bypass, and so but it was a hot day, and he left his little unit and gone up to Bunnings on his mobility scooter. And this was against doctor's orders, because, you know, he'd been told by his doctor and his daughter, don't go out in the heat. And he went out anyway. He'd had half a beer, and he decided, bugger it, because he went out a second time back up to Coles. And the trip was 20 minutes each way on his mobility scooter, and it's on a fairly heavily trafficked stretch of road. And when he got back the second time, even though his unit was air conditioned, he keeled over. And that was when he was only found later by a neighbour who said, you know, normally he turns his air conditioning off by this time, and I'm worried because he hasn't. And the neighbour rang his daughter, and she came over and they found him dead. And it's a particularly significant story because heat is the biggest killer of Australians, of all natural hazards. It kills more people than fire and flood and earthquake and cyclone put together. But it's chronically underreported because it's normally recorded as a heart attack or a stroke or some other cause. But in Chuck's case, Kim Lu wrote down heart attack / heat, and when I heard her give that speech, and then when I thought, yes, this book really is a goer. It will be possible to find the real human stories of people who have died from, the effects of climate change, and so I set off, and what I decided is to try and find examples from. I didn't know, like, when did the body count start? I didn't have answers to these questions. I first had to get a list of natural disasters that took human life of Australia. I mean, this is all based in Australia. And find a list of natural disasters which, according to the climate scientists I interviewed, were definitely attributable to warming, or were made more severe or made more likely by global warming. And so I compiled a rough list, and it does seem, you won't get scientists saying this on the record, but a number of the scientists I interviewed off the record say around about the turn of the century is sort of about when it really starts to get bad. It gets worse. I mean, we've had natural disasters forever here, of course, and they've caused loss of life. In fact, if you do some research into the, more than a century worth of deaths from fire and heat wave and flood, you'll find that death rates per capita have been going down over the course of a century. But that doesn't mean that trend would continue. They've gone down because we've got better at we've got better at forecasting weather. We've got better at recognizing the danger and managing it. We've got better, we dress better. We don't wear as many clothes as they used to wear 100 years ago, when hundreds of people would die from heat waves, at the turn of the last century. But there's no confidence, because heat deaths are underreported. There's no confidence that trend will continue as the planet continues to warm up. And so I compiled a rough list, and I then started to visit the towns, the places where those disasters occurred. And of course, many of those are in regional areas. So I went down to Tasmania to talk to, there were 3 people who died after, I don't know if you'd remember, there was an East Coast low storm that hit during the 2016 federal election campaign. And I went down to try and find, there were 3 people dead. I went down to try and find relatives of those people. So I turned up at a little town called Ouse and to interview Ron Foster, whose father died. And I find him only by talking, going to the pub and saying, do you know any of these family members? And of course, it's a town that's small enough that that everyone knows everyone. And sure enough, I was able to talk to him. Bowling up to a journalist from Sydney, bowling up to a little town unannounced in central Tasmania, I had absolutely no idea of what kind of reception I was going to get, with a project that in some people's minds would be kind of controversial. And what I found was people that were prepared to talk and were quite open to talking about whether global warming played a part or not. And an interview that really stuck in my mind, and a story that has really stayed with me, was the story of the death of Mary Orford, who was in her 70s. She lived with her husband in a little town called Latrobe in northern Tasmania, and their house was flooded when the Mersey River split. In the middle of that storm, there was this intense flash flood, and the Mersey River, which flows down to Launceston, split in half, and as it came around a big clump of trees and coursed around the back of an embankment and then smashed into their A-frame home. And you know, the father, Mary's wife, was who I wasn't able to interview. I was able to interview the sons. He's still quite traumatized, actually. But he calls his sons and says, "There's water on the." He went down in the middle of the night to go. You know, it was quite late. He went down and found there was water on the ground, and he called his son Mark and says, "Mark, I think this we're in trouble. The house is flooding." His son goes down, calls his brother Jared. They try and can't drive through to get to the home. Then you know, the water is rising so fast. You know, they're all worried. They couldn't get a council. The council couldn't get a bulldozer through to the house. They only had to travel about 50 meters to get to this house as the water's rising, and a swift water team from the police couldn't get to them, and there was no availability of a chopper. And then his dad's mobile, he loses track of his mobile. It runs out of battery. So they're on their own, this couple. And he's 82 himself, the dad. And has got his wife, who wasn't very mobile, up on a mattress in their lounge room, floating her as the water rises, and at some point in their A-frame, has to go up a spiral staircase to try and get a blanket for her, can't get back down. She dies in that lounge room. And he held on to that mattress as the waters rose, and we're talking pitch black, freezing water. He held onto that mattress so long that his muscle tore off his arm bone. And he was so traumatized and in shock when the helicopter arrived 8 hours later. It was just outside. He was still up to his knees in freezing cold water. The helicopter was just outside on the rooftop, and when they crashed through his window to get him, he had no awareness that it was there. He was just completely in shock. And when I spoke to the sons about it, they weren't denying. They weren't sure what it was. What was it? Global warming? Was it the hydro letting some water go? They just could not believe it. They're still waiting for the results of an inquest, in fact, which is, more than 4 years later. But what they said to me that rang and stayed in my mind, we don't know what caused it. They're not skeptical of climate change at all. They do believe climate change is happening, but they said this was rain plus. Latrobe has flooded before. It never floods like that. Whatever caused it, this was rain plus. And I thought that summed up a lot, from guys that have lived in that town for decades. They've grown up there, and yes, just left scratching their heads about what on earth caused such an intense flash flood. And so I continued, and I went to Kinglake. I went to talk to people who'd lost loved ones in Black Saturday. I went to Canberra to talk to someone who, find people who'd lost loved ones in the Canberra bushfires of '03. I went to Grantham to talk, and Toowoomba to talk to people who'd lost their, loved ones in the floods of 2011. I interviewed a guy who lost his wife in the Townsville floods of 2019, not to the flood, but he lost her to a tropical soil disease, which Luke mentioned in the introduction, called Meliodosis, which it's normally it wouldn't be fatal, but it just so happened that his wife Leonie, she'd had chemo, she'd had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she was recovering, and she had low immunity, and it knocked her in. Just from splashing, this soil disease comes out of the soil, and they lived in a caravan park, and just from, splashing around and getting a bit of water onto perhaps a bit of broken skin, that's caused her to literally fall over in the caravan and go into unconscious, and he never got to speak to her again. And I spoke to the public health, unit director up at Townsville, who said, well, look, I think that, if you think that the kind of flooding that we saw in Townsville, you know, that month, we're talking January 2019, if you think that there's a connection between that and warming, and you think that, you know, the tropics are expanding, well, I think that you can say that, you know, something like Meliodosis is an example of the kind of danger that we're facing. And so, you know, I wasn't able to prove, of course, with any of it. My aim with this book was to tell a fewer stories, but tell them in some depth, and so that the actual human impact was obvious, and the people that I was interviewing got a chance to hear their thoughts, and of course, none of those deaths, there's definitive proof that, you know, climate change killed this person. You know, it's like you can't definitively prove that climate change, you know, caused any particular extreme weather event, but you can say that, look, it's a factor, and given the warming that we're expecting, well, that it's locked in, even if we're to act on, you know, take radical action on climate change now, we've got a certain amount of warming that's locked in that we're going to experience over the next few decades. Then the risks are clear. The risks that we're running are clear. And yeah, so I ended up talking to, you know, I mean, things that I didn't expect. The thunderstorm asthma outbreak in Melbourne in 2016, 10 people dead. That's never happened anywhere in the world before. And then subsequently, the research comes out, yes, that climate scientists do think that maybe, you know, extra CO2 is making pollen more intense. They do, and clearly the storm that, the weather that happened that day, that is also becoming more frequent. So there is a connection to warming, so in each case, and what I came away, I found the same divisions amongst this random, what feels like a random sample of Australians, you know, who've lost loved ones to climate change, and then I find that they have the same kind of mix of opinions as the rest of the Australian community, and you know, if I started the project thinking that everyone who's had someone die to a natural disaster or extreme weather event or disease that's linked to warming, well, they will all surely be by now convinced of the need for action on climate change. Well, that's not the case at all, because people have not been able to draw the connection, and I think that highlights one of the major takeouts for the book for me, which is that it's not climate change that's killing us, it's ignorance that's killing us. And the reason is that we haven't been warned. We haven't been told by our government, you know, of the health risks that we're running. And I mean, even today, 30 different health groups, have called on the federal government to make climate change, to include it in the National Preventative Health Strategy. I don't know if you would have seen that call. But, you know, scientists have been warning about the health risks of climate change for more than 20 years, including a leading Australian scientist who's a global pioneer of the public health impacts of climate change, Tony McMichael, whose widow I interviewed actually in one of the twists of the book. But what's happened is the federal government, I think, through, you know, it's become so politicized through the last decade of climate wars, the federal government has failed in its duty of care to the Australian public. And so, you know, Australia has a proud history on public health. We had a world-leading campaign to combat HIV/AIDS. We had a world-leading campaign to control tobacco through plain packaging legislation, you know, that caused the tobacco industry to sue us. You know, we have world-leading response to the Port Arthur massacre. We're good on drink driving, good on seatbelts. We have a proud history of public health awareness in Australia, and we've just seen that with the pandemic. We've just seen that Australia has a well-educated population, a strong public health system, and does take our health seriously. And we've seen that in our relatively strong, successful response to the pandemic. But we have this glaring omission that we do not talk about the health effects of climate change. and I think that's deliberate. It's a deliberate failure by the federal government, and one of the things that I hope that this book achieves is to elevate that debate about the public health impacts of climate change. State governments are acting. You have to say, by and large, it's Labor states. So Queensland was early. Queensland is especially vulnerable to warming. Queensland was early to develop a preventative climate and health strategy. The Victorian government came out with one last year. Started work on one last year and has just come out with it early this year. And the WA government has just held a year-long inquiry into the public health impacts of climate change. But at a national level, nothing. And that's despite their own emergency management. They had a climate resilience task force that was looked at and recommended an overarching strategy, and they have failed to implement it. It was shelved for 18 months, almost entirely neglected. I actually tried to do a freedom of information request into why the health department correspondence around implementing a national climate and health strategy, and most of it was redacted. They've done nothing, and so there are official, and this is where I'll end, official forecasts that climate change, from the World Health Organization, climate change will kill 250,000 people a year from 2030. That's only 10 years away. There's no doubt that many of those will be Australians. We are the most, of the rich countries, the most vulnerable to climate change, notwithstanding, our strengths in public health. And we have to get serious about managing these risks. There's plenty of things we can do. We're not bunnies in the headlights, but we have to manage them. We have to stop, building hot boxes, houses that, overheat. They will kill people. We have to stop building next to forests. We have to stop building on floodplains. We have to get serious about the risks that we're running and the danger of the warming that's already locked in. So I hope that that's a useful kind of explanation of what I've been through to write the book, and really, really interested in your questions and comments.
Brilliant, thank you. That's scary and sobering account. And just for anyone who's only just joined us, we're obviously talking about body count, how climate change is killing us. Thank you very much, Paddy. I'm sure everyone's clapping at home. We've got plenty of questions coming through. Some people want to ask themselves, and some people are asking me to read them out. I think a really pertinent one straight up from Karen Newman. What do you think is the main reason for the government's inaction on climate change? Is it their allegiance to fossil fuel organisations? And I might throw in, or is it perhaps more an electoral thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have I've got a million thoughts on that, but I don't have any special insight. I've just, I think that since Tony Abbott toppled Malcolm Turnbull in, 2009, it's been a totemic issue for the Liberal Party. Certainly the Nationals are not on board. Although it's interesting, there was a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald today from a former New South Wales Nationals chairwoman she chaired the New South Wales Nationals women's, I've forgotten her name, but she talking about how she would try to raise climate change. There are some Nats that are trying to raise the impact of climate change, particularly on regional areas, because it's disproportionate. Farmers are going to feel the brunt of it more than anyone. But yeah, between Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce, they made it a totemic issue, I think, for Conservatives that you simply don't, have no truck with this global warming kind of thing. I mean, yes, I think that the donors, whether it's, the coal industry or the gas industry, clearly, we're getting into kind of crony capitalism territory, and that makes you want to campaign for, you know, political donations reform, just ban those donations altogether. And I think there's a good argument for doing that. And I think that, you know, we need an independent commission against corruption at a federal level, and I think that would change our politics. But yeah, I think fundamentally, if you look at someone like Angus Taylor, who's our Energy and Emissions Reduction Minister, absolutely, he will tell you he's not a climate skeptic at all. And the way he runs, he's got a family farm, a family business that runs $400 million worth of rural property. They manage that in accordance with the best climate science. He told me in an interview that I did with him a few years back. But to all intents and purposes, their policy is indistinguishable from one that would have been drawn up by the gas industry. And we've got a national COVID, you know, coordinating commission that's full of people who have connections to the gas industry, and they've recommended a gas-fired recovery. I mean, it's just negligence in my mind. It's complete willful disregard of the warnings of scientists and the direction of the actual, you know, the market itself is pushing for action on climate change. It's hard to explain. So I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer, but yeah, I think that the coalition keeps winning elections on climate, and so they think they can keep doing it. And you know, someone like Joel Fitzgibbon in the Labor Party up in the Hunter Valley there believes that the coalition is right, clearly, and he wants to stop losing elections based on and adopt their policies. So it's quite depressing.
We had a question. Karen was saying, "Great answer, thanks." Question from Julie Muir: is the insurance industry ahead of the government on these issues? That would perhaps make headlines. I remember after the bushfires up here in the Blue Mountains in 2013, the insurance industry came up and gave us some warnings. We were evacuated 4 times last summer up here. So the question there from Julie is: the insurance industry ahead of the government on these issues?
Undoubtedly, the insurance industry has been warning about, you know, the risks of climate change for more than 20 years. There's a cynicism, I think, among some that's a ruse to jack up premiums. But I read you know, just in the context of the California wildfires, I read a fantastic piece in the New York Times magazine the other day, talking about how insurers are starting to pull out. And you know, they're down in Florida from, you know, tropical storms, from you know, fire-prone areas in California, and states in America have had to set up their own insurance schemes, which is a kind of, again, a willful denial of the risk, which is to say, we're going to prop up uninsurable homeowners. And now they're realizing that the liabilities that they're racking up are enormous, and you know, sort of in the billions, and unaffordable. And so there will come a time where homeowners will be told your property is uninsurable, and that will be equally true of fire or flood prone areas in Australia, or areas prone to sea level rise, and once your home is uninsurable, and that's your greatest asset, and therefore the value is, I mean, we've had the same thing here. We've had property owners campaigning against council regulations, which might include some kind of allowance for sea level rise, and say, well, okay, we're going to have a planned retreat, or we're going to, you know, homeowners are just in absolute denial. But at some point that has got a crunch. You know, there's got to be a crunch time where insurers will simply say, we can't afford to insure you anymore, and then the value of properties completely collapses, and then you've got communities that are pretty much exposed and on their own, and so the kind of, yeah, the level of denial, it just can't continue.
I might have to move out of the mountains. Next question I've got is from Damien Ogden. who's organising campaign guru over at the Wilderness Society. You go ahead, Damien.
I'm not sure about that. First of all, thanks, Paddy. It's a great book, and it's also just a really important piece of work as well. My question is around, I think that you've made a really good argument around the health perspective around climate. And we've seen in the United States, a lot of the gains that they've made in state legislatures have been through the EPA and taking it from a health perspective. What I am curious about is, when do we get to a tipping point around creating momentum for policy change, given we've had the bushfires from last year, California's going through it at the moment, and not turn it into, well, this is just now the new normal. This is something that we're expecting every year. And if it's about personal loss, and we don't want everyone to have that personal loss or have that personal stake in the issue, how do we amplify that to turn it into a movement, or to change policy direction?
Well, I don't know, but I do know that this. Well, what I was hoping with this book, God knows if I will achieve it, but is that it will get outside the bubble of the climate policy debate and speak to ordinary Australians about true stories of Australian, loss, bravery, love, courage, and resilience. And I hope, I do think that we were there. The odd thing is, we were there at the turn of the year. It really did feel. I went to a climate emergency summit in Melbourne. I think it was in late January or early February. It really did feel like a moment had arrived where the kind of denial that we've seen from particularly conservative governments for the last decade and more would no longer be sustainable. So for example, when the fires ripped through northern New South Wales towards the end of last year, and Gladys Berejiklian says, "Not today." She does, at a press conference when she's asked about whether the severity of the fires is linked to global warming, she says, "Not today." She was effectively shouted down. When Scott Morrison is trying to force people to shake his hands in Cobargo, or being told to F off, which is, I sort of opened the book that way, his trip to Kangaroo Island, where he gets it wrong how many people have just died. I actually happen to have interviewed, the surviving brother of someone who lost his brother and father in those fires on Kangaroo Island. I thought that was a moment. I thought that was a moment where there was general community acceptance that this weather was not normal. This was not a natural disaster. It was an unnatural disaster, and it was untenable for the government to continue to deny firstly the connection, and secondly to do nothing about climate change. But then the pandemic came, and it's kind of swept climate change off the agenda. And it's been a remarkable thing as a journalist to see a story that has been 100% coverage from all outlets all the time, 24/7 for 6 months. I've never seen anything like it. It's been very hard for any other story to get a look in. Excuse me. But the interesting thing, that delayed my book, The Pandemic, because at the beginning of the year, I was thinking, oh my God, this book is going to be so timely because Australia is completely woken up to the deadly nature of this warming. We're seeing it in front of our face. How many times did you hear people say climate change is here and now? It's happening in front of us. And then the pandemic came and kind of swept it off the news agenda. But interestingly enough, as the book was delayed, waiting for it to see how the pandemic would pan out, and as industry shut down, I got a chance to do more research. And what did I find? Of course, there's a hell of a lot of connections between global warming and this new age of pandemics that we seem to be having, where, whether you start with AIDS, and you come through, whether it's Ebola or new emerging infectious diseases, in particular zoonoses that are spilling over from animals to humans. We've had, SARS and MERS. In Australia, we've had Hendra. There's a number of these. In fact, scientists have been predicting that we would have a pandemic just like this. It was called Disease X. Peter Daszak, who's a specialist in this area, was basically saying it would be a highly infectious respiratory virus, and he predicted it 2 years ago in a World Health Organization meeting, and wrote an article about it. So we are seeing more and more pandemics, and the drivers of global warming and the drivers of pandemics are the same, which is deforestation, urbanization, overpopulation, overconsumption, and plenty of papers coming out almost fortnightly now saying, we can expect more of these kind of pandemics under expected warming. And so, for example, the Chief Victorian Health Officer, Brett Sutton, the Saturday paper ran a story from him the other day. They had leaked audio where he's briefing 200 doctors, and he talks about how we're going to see more years like this one, because of global warming. And so, I think that the penny is. I suppose I'm saying, Damien, thank you for you. I don't have a good answer for your question, but I believe that the penny is dropping, and I hope that it's dropping not just for a small group of experts, but in the general population.
Thanks for that answer, and good question. I should say this always happens. We've got so many questions coming through. We won't be able to get to them all, but Paddy's active on social media. I think you can contact him, get the book, and get his details there. He's available, and he's it's not hiding in an ivory tower.
No.
So if we don't get to your question, please ask, contact him directly. I had a very good question from Adrienne Murphy. I'm not sure if she's not answering my question, whether she wants to ask it herself, but I might just give her one chance to ask it herself if she can hear me there. Adrienne, if you want to ask it yourself, here's your chance.
Hello.
There we go.
Sorry for the delay.
Not at all.
Thanks, Paddy, and thanks, Luke, for organising. Paddy, it's a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your work. I'm interested, I guess we all have a realisation that the responsibility for political and social change and restoring democracy while we're at it sits well and truly with individuals and citizen-led action, given that current government has no intention of acting in the public interest, which of course they're paid to do. How effective do you see citizen-led legal action in the form of class actions as a means to effect change? Thanks.
Well, I think it's fantastic. And one of the things that I wonder is, and I was asked it in a podcast the other day, do you think that there's some kind of, class action around health and this body count, in fact? Is there some liability that, the federal government potentially is running up? And I mean, I'm no lawyer and I couldn't answer that question. But I think cases where, for example, in Holland, a bunch of young people sue the government for failing to protect them from climate change. That's had a huge impact globally, and there are similar cases now running here. I think, I was so glad when Luke told me that the school strike for climate speaker is going to finish off this session today. I absolutely believe we have to get active, and I do wonder whether, sorry to segue, but there was a great book called Merchants of Doubt that looked at how fossil fuel interests had replicated the strategy of the tobacco industry to try and, sow confusion in the public mind and effectively stave off any regulation and also any liability that they might have for the impacts of, smoking. And ultimately, in America at least, that was, in Australia, that was not successful. They did end up with a multi-billion-dollar liability. I know that utilities in the States have been sued. So there was back in, when I wrote about this like a decade ago, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, there was a class action against, the biggest power suppliers like Edison and GE in America, saying you caused climate change. And now that wasn't successful, but the cases are going to keep coming. There's no question about it in my mind that where you've got willful misrepresentation, where you've got negligence, where you've got, any of those other kind of torts that we know well, certainly there will be people willing to have a crack. And, one of the features of this book I found was that the people I interviewed very often felt that they'd been abandoned by their government at the point where there was, their house was on fire, or their, house was threatened by a flood, or they were on their own. And very often in these cases, what has happened in the stories that I've told in this book is that people have been party to class action. So quite apart from then feeling abandoned to the danger because the danger hasn't been recognised, and then they end up having to sue the government for compensation, and that kind of is almost re-traumatizing. And so when the ACT Canberra bushfires, there was a settlement from the ACT itself, a poultry settlement, according to David Tenner, who I interviewed, who lost his wife that day. In the Toowoomba floods, one of the people I interviewed, again, had to sue the government. Black Saturday, obviously, there was a $1 billion class action. In that case, ironically enough, against power line, was it SP Osnet that was supposed to maintain the power lines that helped trigger the biggest fire, the East Kilmore fire and the Black Saturday fires. More than 100 people dead and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage done that they had to set. So Adrian, I'm not sure. Again, there's kind of lots of different angles on your question, but yeah, I think it's very much on the agenda, the legal liability, and I hope that look, I didn't try and put solutions forward in this book. I just tried to tell, because my gut feeling is this debate has sort of become stymied, and it's not resulting in action. I don't know what the circuit breaker is going to be, but the point of this book was to say, while we debate this ad nauseum, when the solutions are obvious and the reasons for not doing it are ridiculous, we debate this ad nauseum, year in, year out, on we go, same debate. And while we do that, people are dying. Australians are dying, and their stories aren't even being told. It's like they're not even being recognised. And I had had coffee the other day. I've sent a book down to David from Canberra, and he said, "I'm glad that you've told Alison's story. He's not a climate evangelist. He's not a climate activist. He says, I'm glad you've recorded it for posterity." And I just nothing could make me more happy than to hear that feedback from one of the people that I interviewed. Once he's seen the book, read the whole thing. I mean, I showed them everything in draft, so everyone had a chance to see what I was writing, and make sure that it was all right. They were happy to say what they said, everything. But to hear him say that, having read the whole thing and seen it in context, that was the highest praise that I could have ever hoped for.
Indeed. Well, we do have activists on this call. In fact, we've got Sophie Chu from the School Strike for Climate. We'll give her the floor for a minute to talk about the climate strike on Friday, and then I'll come back to you, Paddy, for a final word. And then, as I promised earlier, we'll play a song. During the song, you can stay on the line, and I'll open up the chat so everybody can chat to everybody else, send Paddy a message, put links in the chat section, etc. But I'll hand the floor now to Sophie Chu, who is a School Strike for Climate organiser from Melbourne. Are you there, Sophie?
Yes, I am. Before I get started, I'd just like to recognise that I am speaking to you guys from Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, because sovereignty was never ceded and you can't have climate justice without First Nations justice. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here because this book sounds really interesting and the kind of stuff that people need to be learning about. I'm Sophie, I'm 17 years old and I'm from so-called Melbourne. I'm involved in School Strike for Climate because we are the generation who are prepared to inherit this planet and, of course, subsequently, the damage that previous generations have done to it. And we have to combat the effects of this harm because it's our only choice and the alternative is, quite frankly, too scary to consider. And that's why I'm taking action on this Friday, September 25th. So on September 25th, School Strike are aiming to send a united, powerful message to the federal government that we won't stand for our public money being used to expand gas that will turbocharge the climate crisis and destroy First Nations lands. We need a COVID recovery that puts the climate and communities' futures first. On this day, we'll be standing in solidarity with First Nations people who have been fighting against gas fracking on country, which is stealing sacred land and it's been poisoning their water for a long time. This is a really great opportunity for Australia to invest in the clean jobs of the future and recover from COVID while reaching ambitious climate targets. And as such, we would be able to create thousands of jobs in climate-friendly industries and kickstart the economy. This date's also going to coincide with an International Day of Global Action through the Fridays for Future network. So young people all across the world will be standing up to demand that governments unite behind the science in their coronavirus economic recoveries. I personally believe that as we demand climate justice, it's really important that we work with unions because although we might want to stop dangerous fossil fuel projects, we absolutely cannot leave coal and gas workers behind. And building a better future for every single person requires all of us, every single person, whether you're a student or a unionist, to work in solidarity towards our shared objective. We've been reaching out to unions from the start because we need workers to build the future Australia that we can all be a part of. And there's absolutely no social change or justice without workers fighting and campaigning. Moreover, action on climate change will lead to millions of jobs and people must be protected by their unions in these workplaces. That's why we're so glad that our Day of Action will be supported by unions representing over 1.5 million Australian workers. That includes the Maritime Union of Australia National, the United Workers Union National, the Australian Nurses and Midwives Federation, and the Health Services Union. So what are the details? On this Friday, September the 25th, which is 2 weeks out from the federal budget, we'll be demanding action. Because of how close we are to the federal budget, we have an absolutely critical opportunity to influence the allocation of federal funds, but we need to start building that pressure right now. That's why actions will be happening all across Australia. Each action will be small and absolutely COVID safe, of course, and we've got more than 400 registered so far, which is really exciting. Everybody will be involved, whether you're a school striker, a member of a union, from a First Nations community, a worker, a family, or anything in between. That involves communities, whether they're affected by gas expansion or whether you live in a city or a town. So our demands for the day are that we want no public funds for gas and other damaging fossil fuel projects. Instead, we want recovery funds to resource Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led solutions that guarantee land rights and care for country. We need to fund the creation of jobs that fast-track solutions to the climate crisis and help communities recover. And we absolutely must fund projects that transition our economy and communities to 100% renewable energy by 2030 through expanded public ownership. So how can you act? What you can do is you can go to our website, which I believe should be in the chat, and find the action closest to you or register your own event. All small actions will be organised observing current safety restrictions on a state-by-state basis, and all event hosts are advised to follow safety precautions individual to their location. For example, I'm in Melbourne, so it's kind of illegal for me to leave the house to protest right now. So what I'm doing instead is I'm helping to work on the National Online Rally from 6 to 7:30 AEST. That's going to wrap up our most widespread day of action yet, and we'll hear from speakers from loads of gas-affected communities. For example, we're really excited to have Joe Schofield, the president of the United Workers Union, speaking for us at that rally. We'll also be taking action and encouraging viewers from all across the nation to contact key federal decision makers via email, phone, and even social media. So beyond September 25th, School Strike plans to be organising roundtable meetings with unionists and student strikers to work together to fight for a better future. This is a long-term campaign and a long-term plan, and we've had some big wins already, but we're only just getting started. We plan on using our collective strength to achieve this absolutely crucial environmental, social, and political transformation. Thank you again for listening to me, and I look forward to having your support on Friday as we demand that the government fund our future, not gas. Thank you.
Well done, Sophie. That's brilliant, mate. You're getting a lot of praise in the chat, which, as I said, we'll change to everyone can message everyone in just a minute. So everyone keep those messages coming directly to Sophie. It's and of course I've posted in the chat the links to both the School Strike for Climate Union sign-on statement and also to the School Strike for Climate list of actions. But for now, I want to thank Paddy Manning. It's been absolutely brilliant. The questions are coming thick and fast. Sorry to the people who can't ask you questions, but I've posted Paddy's Twitter handle in there, so you know, keep the conversation going. I've posted the link to where to buy the book as well. We'll post this video itself to YouTube tomorrow. If you've enjoyed this, please share it. It'll be on the Search Facebook page and on our YouTube. Share it to send it to a friend, send it to a mate. Get the word out there. We know that the right wingers don't hide their, you know, they don't hide their light behind under a bushel. They share everything. So, you know, fake news gets around the world in a flash, and the truth isn't out of bed yet. So, relying on you guys who've been here today to share that around. So, share the video of this tomorrow if you can, and get a copy of the book. I want to give Paddy Manning the last word before we go to a song. So, but before I do that, thanks to Paddy. Thanks to New International Bookshop as well, who've co-hosted this event and promoted it. Thanks to Sophie Chu, Tim Davis, Frank from School Strike for Climate has been really instrumental in making this happen as well. So thank you to all those people. And finally, I'll give the last word to Paddy before we go to a song.
Thanks, Luke. I'll just really briefly acknowledge the Ku-ring-gai people, because I've just worked out they are the traditional owners, and that's why it's called the Ku-ring-gai National Park. And I should have I should have Googled that before to work out whose land I was actually looking at today. And just to say that the School Strike for Climate was one of those things that I think, you know, just as we saw with Craig Rewcastle's climate series, you know, just now on the ABC, you know, one of those things that was the most inspiring thing and was a real marker for me, even as an onlooker, you know, over the last 18 months. And there is a chapter, although body count sounds like it's grim, how climate change is killing us. I actually found a lot of hope in the people I interviewed, and the fact that they will look after each other when crisis hits. And Australians we've just shown you through this pandemic, are capable of collective action and acting together to look after each other, and we're going to need that as we go forward. And so I asked Luke to play this particular song because it's got a line in it which says, "Even if things get a little bit heavy, we'll all float on all right." And so that's a message that I think is of hope, that I think you know, we have to keep in mind. So thank you so much for listening to me bang on today, and I hope that you read and enjoy the book and pass it on to people, because I've tried to dead set get out of the bubble with this one. And thank you so much, and I hope you like this song, by the way, which is a band called Modest Mouse.